Hello, Alex. It's a great pleasure to have you here today in Barcelona at the Reuters event. And I think we met also to talk a little bit about the new EU HTAR regulation, which is now in place since January this year, especially for ATMP and oncology products. But maybe you want to tell us a little bit more about the role of EUCOPE because you're leading the EUCOPE organization in this context.
Thank you very much, Herbert. It's a great pleasure to be here. First of all, yes, EUCOPE is very active in the space of the European Health Technology Assessment in the area of the JCA and also the JSC. EUCOPE is a trade organization which is 17 years old. We have been founded in the year 2008. And we are comprised of 170 innovative pharma and biotech companies, also some medtech companies, all innovative, no generics. We are representing more the mid-size pharma and biotech angle, so many rare disease companies, orphan drug companies, ATMP companies. And by talking about ATMPs and oncology, you can already see that our members are very much impacted by the EU HTA regulation. And hence, we've decided already some years ago to prioritize the topic, to play a leading role in Brussels about this topic. And we are now, to be concrete about your question, we are working very closely with the other trade organizations in Brussels, FPA, ARM, and Europa Bio, to voice the industry perspective when it comes to the EU HTA, to coordinate submissions into consultations and so on. So we are, I would say, and that's really thanks to the great work the colleagues are doing in Brussels, not just in EUCOPE, also in the other trade organizations, we're really speaking with one voice when it comes to the EU HTA, and I think that is very important.
Yeah, I agree, Alex. It's very important that industry gets a voice in this interaction because, as I experience in interaction with many manufacturers, they don't feel heard really in this process. So when it was designed in the pilot phase, when UNETA 21 was orchestrating all that, I think it's super important to have a voice, especially for the small and mid-sized companies. What are the main concerns, especially your members are having when they are talking about EU HTAR implementation?
Thanks for that very important question, Herbert. I mean, indeed, the right to be heard is a key issue in any HTA procedure. So what I'm known from my home country, which is Germany, is that I can actually go to GBA and seek scientific advice twice. I could come before I design my clinical trials in an ideal scenario, and I could come later on to talk about the endpoints and the comparators and so on. And that is really what we think is lacking in the EU HTA, is slots for the joint scientific consultations, the so-called JSCs. So it's really about an interaction, especially for the smaller companies. Especially the smaller companies don't have the resources to actually go national and try to find advice and get the opinion of all those national HTA institutions involved in the EU HTA in the coordination group. So it's really important that, especially for smaller companies, that there is the opportunity to talk, actually, to understand what the HTA institutions are thinking, what the comparator should be. We call it PICO schemes, what the PICO schemes should look like. Because it's a bit like in school. If I don't know what is expected from me, I might not hit the nail on its head, and I might not really submit a very good dossier. And that would really be a shame, just because of no opportunities to consult before we are submitting a dossier, that there is a poor dossier, and that would ultimately lead to a poor outcome in terms of access for innovative medicines.
Yeah, that's very relevant comments, of course. And based on my experience talking to different companies, bigger and smaller company, this early dialogue between EMA and HTA bodies is an important phase while preparing your clinical trials. At the same time, I see companies also hesitating to leverage that because they don't know exactly what does it mean. It's an early phase, it's non-binding, there are not enough slots. How educated are the HTA bodies to contribute to this insights? Who is willing to do that? The criteria to qualify for a joint scientific consultation are clearly spelled out, but how to prioritize that if more companies are requesting that is not very clear. So there are a lot of uncertainty what to do that compared to local early advice meetings like in the UK, Natz is doing, or Germany with the GBA advice, what you mentioned already. So what do you hear? Are the companies in your groups more hesitating or more actively leveraging this opportunity to go to a joint scientific consultation?
All right. I mean, we don't have much experience yet. I think there are very few slots in the year 2025 available only. And on the others, and on top of that, it's also that you should really come early. So I don't think the coordination group would pick a product which is soon to come in the next, let's say, 6 months, because then all the clinical trials have been conducted and so on. So there's not much you can change at that stage in terms of the clinical trial design. So some people would say it does make a whole lot of sense to seek scientific advice at that late stage, but there are few slots. So to your question, there are few experiences yet, but you're making a very important point. It's about the lack of resources, and this is also what we hear from the other side of the table, from the assessor side of the table, that the HTA bodies in the coordination group seem not to have the resources to actually bring people into not just doing the evaluations in the JCA, but also doing the joint scientific consultations. We are grateful that GBA has volunteered to do that in the early phase. This is really what is very important. And to your question, what our members are doing, it's a bit of these days, it's not entirely clear what all the membership is doing. There's no practice yet because we are so early stage. But one thing is very clear, we are encouraging our members to actually seek and get any opportunities they could have, be it at the national level or at the EU level, to talk about the dossier submission, to talk about what the comparator and the endpoints should look like. Because as I said, it's very important to be well informed before you're putting your dossier submission into the JCA procedure.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I think it's important that, as we know, that it's a learning system. So the HTA bodies, the coordination group, also, of course, the manufacturers, the patient organization and the physician organization, which are participating in the JSC and the JCA, they all have to learn how to best implement this new regulation to make sure that it really delivers to the objectives, which is reduction of bureaucracy, which is equal access to innovative medicines across Europe, and of course, to increase the quality of the assessments of the evidence. So it's important to go into this dialogue so that we give also the opportunity to every participant there, the HTA body, the EMA, and others, to learn from that and improve the system. I heard about this shadowing program that smaller countries which don't have this expertise, like in France or in Germany, GBA and HIS have, to learn from them how to do that. Is this happening already, or do you see any kind of activities in this direction, that smaller countries are leaning towards the bigger countries and learn from them?
I mean, there's nothing really official yet about this, but there are, of course, discussions in the EU HTA stakeholder network, and we are a member in the EU HTA stakeholder network. And but there haven't been really bigger discussions about how they would organize themselves in the coordination group. But it is very fair to assume that it makes a whole lot of sense for the smaller HTA institutions to learn from the bigger ones, which might have just more experiences because they've seen more innovative medicines running through their national HTA systems, but also to piggyback a little bit and to take on the resources of the bigger institutions. So that would make a whole lot of sense, because let's not forget about, it's all about the quality of the dossier and it's all about the quality of the assessment. And that includes the assessors. It's not just including procedures and opportunities to speak early on. It's also about the assessments and the rules. So it's all about quality, because let's not underestimate the importance of the EU HTA for access of innovative medicines in Europe, and also for the competitiveness of the European Union. If we got this procedure right, I think we can definitely have a competitive advantage towards other parts of the world in having an established procedure, a robust, high-quality procedure to assess individual medicines for their value, and ultimately having access for those medicines. So I think that's the ultimate goal, to increase patient access in innovative medicine. So that's what we are all up for.
Yeah, I think you touch an important point here that, of course, the attractiveness of Europe is something important to stabilize the European Union aspect here, and also make sure that all patients across Europe have equal access to innovative medicine, of course. Yeah, when I talk to some of the companies, especially global companies, at the moment, they prefer to go to the US. They say Europe is very fragmented, so many different healthcare systems, and so. So, as you said, the successful implementation of the regulation is important. How do we find the right KPIs to measure success? How are you involved as EUCOPE to define these kind of measures to improve the system as fast as possible so that it delivers against these objectives?
Very important question. We are involved actually in any horizontal measure where industry is consulted about the implementation and the execution of the EU HTA regulation. So we are consulted by the European Commission together, as I mentioned before, with FPA, ARM and Europa Bio as European trade organizations about any of those horizontal issues. Horizontal issues could be drafting guidances, drafting templates, documents of the coordination group. We are consulted at an early stage to give in our input in these type of templates, procedures, and guidances. So that is very important, especially in the early phases of such a system, that you take into account the industry input. Because one thing I must say, when I compare it again with my HTA procedure, which I know from Germany, the voice of industry, of the individual company, is less articulated or heard in the EU HTA procedure when I compare it to the GBA procedure. In the GBA procedure, for example, you have a hearing after 4.5 months usually, right? So that is not foreseen in the EU HTA. What is very positive, and I would want to mention that is the fact that the voice of the experts and the patients are clearly there, much more than in other national procedures. But the voice of the industry could be, in my opinion, not necessarily louder, but just to be heard more. It's a bit distant from the pharma. The pharma companies are being kept a little bit distant in that process as someone who is putting in a submission and then needs to wait until the final result is coming, which is something we can improve, in our opinion.
Yeah, I think it's a very important situation when we receive the JCA report as a result from the JCA process after the PICO assessment and the dossier submission and the dossier assessment. This JCA report plays an important role, and it has to be seen about what kind of quality we will get back if the industry is not so much involved in that. But even more, how this report is respected by the countries. Do you have any expectation what kind of impact this JCA report will have? And if you look in Germany, but also maybe other countries, will they respect that as part of their local assessment and hopefully not doing redundant work, which is one of the objectives here?
Yeah, that's a key question, I would say, when it comes to the JCA. What does it mean for the national level? Because we all know it's all about the national level to make decisions about the value of a medicine, and it's all about the national level to find the price for a medicine, whether it's in a price negotiation like in Germany or whatever the procedure is. So it's really key to have an uptake of the JCA, if I may call it like that, as we call it in industry, that we have a robust quality-based JCA report, because only then the report will be respected by the member state level. But I'm confident, to be honest, that this work is very relevant and that the JCA report will be very much respected at the national level, because I just can't foresee a situation where the same institutions sit around the table in the coordination group in Brussels or wherever they meet, and then 6 months later would say, well, no, it's all for the bin. We don't use this. We do something different. Apart from the fact that they should take it into consideration, that's what the regulation says. That's a legal terms. I mean, that leaves a lot of leeway and freedom for them to do it or to do other things, to ask for additional data. But I'm very confident that it will play an important role for the national decision making, simply because of the fact that there is a lot of resources going into the JCA report, also from the national institutions being part of the coordination group. So I'd be surprised if that is not really taken as very relevant or even as a basis for national decision making, which is what it should be.
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting situation to see what the kind of impact this report will have. I mean, we had this UNETA 21 pilots. I myself was participating in 2 of them. And if the JCA report is maybe not so much in favor of the innovative medicine, which is going to be launched in the country, then I sometimes see industry trying to deviate from the report and say, okay, we have better data, we can interpret it in a different way and things like that. They didn't have the chance in the JCA procedure to really comment on that. So that's, of course, one of the gaps here. And on the other side, the HTA bodies locally will also leverage it in their pricing and reimbursement discussions and defining what are the criteria for that, what is the price level, what is the comparator in their local situation. So it has to be seen how it is leveraged, of course, and therefore the quality of the report is super important, of course. Furthermore, I expect when I'm talking to different companies that especially the 3-4 year launch sequence in Europe may be squeezed from the back end side. So that especially the countries in Central Eastern Europe, smaller markets, may benefit from this new regulation because they don't have to do the assessment again or in all the same detail as it was done in the JCA. Would you agree that the bigger countries will less benefit than the smaller countries from this new regulation?
Well, I would say it depends. I would generally, as I said before, think that there will be an uptake of the JCA at the national level in all the countries, irrespectively of the size of the country. You're very much right to say like the smaller countries have a basis for decision making about individual products for their pricing decisions much more than in the past, because many of them haven't done HTA processes. So there is a hopefully robust report for them as a basis for decision making. But for the bigger countries, it's probably replacing what GBA has been doing about the clinical evaluations about an individual medicine within AMNOG. I don't think they will do that part again at home in a completely different setting. So I think, and I hope actually, that the JCA will replace existing clinical evaluations of individual medicines in national HTA procedures. That's what it's there for, and that's what it's supposed to do. And I'm optimistic and confident that this will be the place. So I would say both benefit, the smaller countries and the bigger countries.
Yeah, you're right. And when I look into Italy, they have just done their local reform, but also many other countries are adjusting their local HTA procedures now to better fit with the new EU regulation. So yeah, we have to see how this is implemented and how the resources, also in the bigger countries, are contributing to this new process. Yeah, we have now, since January, this EU HTAR in place, as we said, for ATMP and oncology products now in 28 for rare diseases, and then from 2030 on for all products. Do you think that's a too long process, or is it the right sequence to go for?
Well, whether it's the right sequence is another question. I would say, like, I would just make a comment. I can't change it, right? We're starting with the most complex products, oncology and ATMP. Cell and gene therapies, very complex to understand the mode of action, and also complex products in terms of supply chain. So we're starting with the most difficult ones, which is maybe not the right starting point, but it's too late to discuss at a point. So, but the sequencing in itself makes a whole lot of sense to say, like, let's start small, let's get bigger over time, and let's finish it up with all centrally approved medicines and some medical devices, not to be forgotten, in 2030. So that makes a whole lot of sense, because the system is not ready yet to assess 50 centrally approved medicines within 1 year. We don't have the resources. We don't have the slots for joint scientific consultations. So we need to give the system time to develop, to get experiences within HTA institutions, within the commission, with patient organizations, clinical experts, and last but not least also within industry. So I think that sequencing makes a whole lot of sense. Whether you need to start with the most complex products is another question, but it is what it is.
Thanks a lot for this comment. Is it also difficult to start with the most complex products because you don't have so much physician experts for certain disease areas, or the patient organizations, the patient voice is maybe not so easy to collect for these kind of areas, disease areas?
That's the most relevant point indeed. I mean, in rare diseases, in ultra rare diseases, in ATMPs, there's not always the expertise. When I just take ATMPs, cell and gene therapies, you might have a disease expert who's not really familiar with ex vivo or in vivo gene therapy. So that person might be a very good oncologist, but he's not an expert when it comes to the CAR T cells. So you're right. In a way, it is difficult also to start with rare diseases, and most ATMPs, as we've seen them so far, are also rare diseases. So those rare disease products are in the procedure, no doubt. So that's the tricky part about it. And you're mentioning it, the point of like bringing expertise into the procedure, and that is a very important point, because the conflict of interest rules, which of course, no doubt, have to be there. We don't want to have an expert in the procedure which is in a way biased, or which has really worked for a long time for industry, has been paid for very long times by industry. We do want to have someone who is not conflicted in these type of procedures, and actually the same is true for patient organizations. There needs to be a conflict check, no doubt. However, the way the rules are set is very strict, and especially in ultra rare diseases and rare diseases, it's difficult to find experts. So what's the value of having an expert who's not really an expert, because the real expert and maybe the second real expert is somewhat conflicted due to very strict conflict of interest rules? So we need, especially in rare disease, in the rare disease area and ultra rare diseases, we have to have some flexibility to make sure that we're really getting the clinical experts into the procedure. Because let's not forget about the fact that we also need to activate them and encourage them to be part of the procedure, because it's going to be also time for them to participate in the JCA procedure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Alex. When I listen to you, I think you are a strong advocate to having clinicians and patient organizations involved in this process and make them heard, because all the regulation is focusing on the European population, on the patients which are suffering from these diseases. Is this right?
That's right. This is very important. We have been always advocating for patient involvement in any national HTA procedure, as we've seen it in EMA for a long time. There's no doubt that patient organizations can have a voice, can have an influential voice. It's not just about having a voice, it's about having an influence on decision making. That is true for regulatory processes at the EU level. So it's really important that we do the same when it comes to an important decision making process like the EU HTA. So I very much agree that this is an important goal, which actually has been achieved.
Yeah. No, great. As we are coming a little bit to the end here from this very nice dialogue, I have to say I could continue for quite some time, definitely. We know that this EU HTA regulation is now implemented, of course, but it's not the only regulation which is shaping the European environment right now. So what other regulations like GPL and how they are connected with this EU HTAR?
Yeah, the first one I want to mention is something which we have seen recently released by the European Commission, I think in mid-March only. It's the Critical Medicines Act. And many people had expected the Critical Medicines Act to focus primarily on generics, supply chain shortages, taking the lessons learned from the pandemic, ensuring that we not just have a robust supply chain, but also that we have production capacities in certain essential medicines really here in Europe. But it has gone beyond that. It has gone beyond that in that sense that it's now also including innovative medicines, which are then branded as essential medicines, which is an important branding maybe to have, but you might be subject to the joint clinic, not just to the joint clinical assessment, but also to joint procurement, joint price negotiations, which is clearly foreseen in that regulation, which is somewhat, I would even say, encouraged by the European Commission. And this is where it becomes relevant in the context of the EU HTA. The JCA report will be the basis for public joint procurement or joint price negotiations, whatever we want to call it. It's not clear how it will be spelled out in all the details. So that shows that the Commission is clearly thinking also around the EU HTA to consider what we can do with the JCA report, and that if I may call it, the foot in the door of Brussels in national pricing and reimbursement decisions is getting much bigger. So the influence of Brussels in that respect is getting much bigger. The second point I would like to quickly mention is primarily around, but not only, it's also about regulatory process. It's a GPL, the General Pharmaceutical Legislation, which is about making sure also that we're taking the lessons learned from the pandemic, that we are introducing innovative processes at the EMA level. But where it's really relevant for industry is when it comes to IP rights, when it comes to regulatory data protection, and also orphan exclusivity. There is much more conditionality than what we've seen today. It's 8+2+1 regulatory data protection and 10 years orphan exclusivity. The orphan exclusivity will be put under condition whether you're launching in all EU countries in a given period of time. Same is true for regulatory data protection. It is also subject to condition if there is a high medical need and if you have comparative clinical trials. So many ifs, which we fear off a little bit, that it could fear off investors in the early phases, that they would only take baseline RDP and baseline orphan exclusivity. So I stop there, but very important
Other thing.
Development.
Yeah, I think you underline very nicely that this kind of European concept around healthcare management is a long-term perspective which really focuses on patients. So shorten the HTA assessment, reduce bureaucracy, increase the quality, make the JCE report an important outcome of this process. So to then also go into maybe joint procurement and price negotiation, which will again shorten the time of access for patients across Europe. While in Germany you have access maybe after 1 week of EMA approval due to the German AMNOG system, but in Romania and Hungary it could take up to 3-4 years, sometimes not even launch the product. So patients are very different situations across Europe.
Right. All this conditionality I just talked about when it comes to regulatory data protection and orphan exclusivity. This modulation has been introduced by the European Commission in order to increase access in lower income countries in Europe. And that's something we in industry, we need to work on. We are very clear about this. Although we can certainly say it's not only taking the company's decisions, it's also about the decision of the governments or the payers to reimburse a medicine. It sometimes is also about the time that it takes for them to make decisions. But it's very much also about industry, about the companies to launch in all EU countries. And it's very hard to find a justification why a centrally approved medicine is not launched in all EU countries, for sure. Whether joint procurement is a solution to that, it clearly worked in the pandemic when we had a very different situation there, no doubt. But I'm a bit more skeptical whether that's a magic weapon here or the solution to all our problems. Because, if we would bring the price down at a certain level in Europe, if we would clearly walk away from the German price and meet somewhere in the middle between the lower income countries in Germany, France, Italy on the other hand side, we would lower prices. And you've heard what the US administration is saying about cheaper prices in Europe and that the US will be subsidizing those prices. If the US starts to reference prices in Europe, and if those prices would drop, I think we have to be very careful that we are keeping the level of access as we have it today. But certainly, and don't get me wrong, no doubt, it's a clear political objective, and it's also some homework to do for industry to make sure that we do everything we can to increase the uptake of centrally approved medicines in all EU countries.
Super. Thank you very much for the time today, Alex. It was a pleasure talking to you. I think we are in an exciting moment right now. The next 5 years will be super important to see what the different regulations will bring and how they are implemented, how they are respected as well. And hopefully, finally, the patients will benefit from it. That's what we wish all for. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks to you, Herbert, and thanks to Cencora for having me. It's a pleasure.
All the best.